Okay, geographers, let's pick back up here. Let's get more into what cultural geography is all about, what we're going to be all about in the upcoming weeks. So I was getting into this whole idea of context and place and stuff like that before, and the first of these, I think it's going to be 3 lectures altogether that revolves around this one PowerPoint thing. But now we're going to get into something a little different, but how we, how we approach studying the world around us, and that's more complicated than you might think, or we often tend to initially think. Right? We tend to think that reality is simply it's reality. Come on, but no, it's way more complicated than that. And this term here on your screen, one of the best, most important words to know and to think about, it's epistemology. Now this word, you can Google it and you can find different things, and there are different ways of using the word, or you can say it's the study of knowledge or systems of knowledge or whatever. The way it was first explained to me and the way I explain it to my students is epistemology means how we know what we know. Okay, simple as that. And that may sound way too simple, or like what the hell are you talking about? But what's really important is to understand that different people have different ideas about reality. Right, or on here on this slide right here, so different people have different ideas about the truth, and you noticed, sure, because you're an astute young geographer, that truth is in quotation marks, right? Truth is a garbage word. It's very important to realize as you begin to study this stuff. Truth it's relative. Truth means different things to different people. So to speak of trying to find the truth, it's useless. It's nothing we can really make use of. Okay, and I'm going to give you examples of this stuff, but we do see this all the time, right? You have things, whether we're looking at any events in the news, political things like that, family members, right, with whom we disagree about how the world works, we can say, like, what is wrong with them? You can argue with people all the time, and they just don't get it, right? Well, no, what it really is again, it's that idea of truth. It's fuzzy. It's not a very useful thing. Okay, so the idea is, we have reality out there. We have facts and things like that people argue for. In fact, in this present moment in time, in a post-2016 election kind of thing. I mean, do you remember? My God, it was so cute. Roughly 4 years ago now, as I'm recording this, when what's her face, Kellyanne Conway, I think, is the one who came up with the term alternative facts, and everybody went, "What? Come on, no, facts are facts, and truth is truth, and reality is reality." And don't get me wrong, the whole alternative fact thing, talking about like crowd size or whatever it was, that's crazy talk. But this idea of facts being some perfect thing that exists, like things that were brought down from the heavens or whatever, that's actually something we should question. All right, so because facts, we could take facts, like what's a fact? Anything, numbers and measurements and things like that. Yeah, we can take that stuff, but it's how we use them. Right? How we interpret these things, which facts we pick and which facts we leave behind and stuff like that. How are we approaching reality? How are we approaching this idea of knowledge and truth and all of that? Right? That's where we got to start questioning. Okay? Now, keeping with the whole current events kind of thing, I have a few things in here. This is when I started doing, I don't know, I think this was in 2018, maybe? When this happened, again, everything is a blur at this point. Things we all do this. We forget about, what was the last crazy thing to happen in the news, a few weeks after it it happens. But when this happened, I thought, oh, this is perfect for, teaching purposes. I wanted to share this with students. But do you guys remember this? When Trump, he was in a meeting with some, I think, senators or I don't know, whoever, and they were talking about immigration stuff, and he apparently referred to certain countries. I think it was like Uganda and El Salvador, countries like that, as shitholes. And then he was also wondering why we weren't getting more, immigrants from places like Norway or something like that. Now, a few things here. Number one, when this first happened, I remember I was actually, it happened, and then I was going during, the winter intersession to talk to another class, to talk about geography or whatever, and I mentioned this thing because it just happened. And I was excited to talk about it because it connected with geography and stuff we talk about and all that. And I remember saying this, did you guys hear how Trump called these countries shitholes? And one of the students, in the back of the room, said, allegedly, right? Very, very angrily. And that, God, that was chilling. Just to think that anybody would be that defensive over stuff like this. We get that worked up over one politician over another or whatever. Here's the point. I don't bring this up to make fun of Trump or support Trump or whatever. That's the most boring thing in the world. And you'll see in this class, I'll gladly bring stuff up and mock pretty much anybody in power in here. We'll see. It's equal opportunity offense. We'll move forward there. But again, it's not like who cares what team you root for or whatever. What's fascinating is to think about that this was said. Whether who cares if he said it or not? It matters, right? It's not like he's gonna get fired or whatever for this. So let's say he says it. Okay. Now what's fascinating to me, and therefore it better be fascinating to you because I'm going to talk about it for a little while here, is the idea of how different people responded to this. Because some people went, oh, outrageous, and other people went, well, yeah, I mean they are, right? These are terrible countries. You want to go live, in Uganda or whatever, right? And so there are different responses here, and that I thought was the great thing, right? That with Trump, he's so extreme and so unpolished and all that as a politician, right? He doesn't bother trying to lie, and disguising stuff or saying one thing to make us think this, right? He just, says whatever, right? And so what's fascinating with him being in power is that we get to kind of watch this stuff happen, and it's a good way to question our institutions and think about what what they mean and what's going on and all that, right? So I brought this thing up, and I would usually talk about this one, but we've got other stuff too, and I'm not going to touch on each of these, but all of these things will get to help you think about this idea of epistemology and different ways in which we engage with the facts and reality and all that stuff. But another important one is this right here, BLM, Black Lives Matter. I mean, it is, what it is. It's a movement, and there's an actual, group that refers to themselves as Black Lives Matter, but it's transcended that, and it's become a huge thing with, protests, some of them being, peaceful and everything's been fine, some of them being violent and, and all of that. Again, it's the kind of deal where you can say Black Lives Matter and somebody says, yeah, right on, all right? And you're with that. Or you say Black Lives Matter and people freak out. Or they say, no, all lives matter. Or blue lives matter. Or we have these different lives mattering and all of that. And it's the same thing, right? We're dealing with whatever it is, however you want to think about Black Lives Matter here. You want to, look at an actual protest going on or someone giving a speech in reference to Black Lives Matter. That's the thing, but it's how we all process that individually. You students who I'm speaking to now, some of you, see this, you read this and all that, and this makes you happy, right? Whereas others might look at this and be disgusted or terrified or whatever. And I say full well knowing that's the case, because you'll be happy to know, I don't know if I've talked to you guys about this, but your own faculty members at Antelope Valley College are in the same boat, right? Where some of us, wanted to have Black Lives Matter, like this statement immediately put on the website for the college, and people changing their avatars and stuff like that to something BLM related, or adding it to their email signatures or things like that. And whereas other faculty members don't like it. I'm trying to be neutral here and not give too much away on how I feel. But yeah, you had the people who were fine with Black Lives Matter, and then the other people who freaked out big time, convinced that Black Lives Matter, it's all a bunch of violent Marxists who are trying to overthrow not just this country, but like Western civilization and stuff like that. All right, look, we're going to talk about Marxism in a little bit, because that's something that cracks me up, how like nobody actually knows what it is. So we'll cover that later on. But again, think about this as we go through, and I'll kind of come back to this idea, like, why is it that some people like this and don't like this? And it's not as simple as, it's, the people who don't like it are racist, and the people who do like it are, not racist, or those people are racist against white people, or whatever. No, it's not that simple. It's fuzzier, and it all has to do with epistemology and how we view the world and try to get knowledge. And then here's another way to look at it too, in keeping with like the movement to defund the police, Black Lives Matter, related in many cases, but technically separate concepts here. But that idea, right, of police and how we feel about the police, that's something that comes from our backgrounds, right? That's influencing how we see the world around us, how we view stuff. And so to say something like police officer, cop, whatever, sheriff, however you want to say it, or to see a police car or whatever, think about what that means for you, right? Do you get excited? Do you get nervous? Do you, feel some sense of pride or discomfort or whatever? Doesn't mean that if you don't like the cops, you're a criminal. And if you do like the cops, you're a good person or whatever. And again, it doesn't mean you're, the whole racist thing, whether we're talking about, referring to certain countries as being shitholes and other ones not being that way, or we're talking about Black Lives Matter, defunding the police, or whatever. Like the argument that, if you don't agree with me, you're a racist, that's meaningless, that's useless. And when I start talking about race, we'll get into that it's never as simple as, like, no one identifies as a racist. Even if you are racist, you probably don't say, I'm a racist, right? You behave a certain way. Again, because of, in part anyway, this epistemology, this idea of how we know what we know, how we gather data and turn that into information, right? Whether we're doing it consciously or not. Okay, so here's some kind of current event things we can think about as we move forward. All right, now these approaches toward gaining knowledge, right? They come in a variety of forms. This first one here is called positivism, and it's where you're using science and numbers, data in general, to get answers. Okay, through statistics, through quantitative measurement, things like that. So we approach the world as a scientist. Okay? If this is what we do, this is our default mechanism for learning about the world. And again, like with positivism here, like I'm playing a little fast and loose with this stuff. So when we're talking about epistemology, we're typically discussing kind of a more formalized way of going out and trying to gain knowledge, right? So like I'm doing a research project, right? And so from that standpoint, that's important to know, because you can read scientific work, academic research, things like that, and you can get a variety of conflicting reports or theses or whatever, because some people will, say, approach a problem using positivism, and other people will do some of these approaches I talk about later on, right? So the research that we read, the books that we read, the information that we're gathering, that kind of stuff, that's connected to epistemology. But I think also what's also important, and especially for those of us who you're starting out as a college student, you're not necessarily thinking about, what's my big research project? What approach am I going to take to study X, Y, and Z? It's important to realize that this also just kind of bleeds over to how we process any information that we get, right? Something we see online, something a friend tells us, or, something a stranger tells us, or whatever, right? So with positivism, we're looking for the numbers. We want to run the tests. We want to do the math, the science, whatever it might be, to get answers. So if we're talking about, say, shithole countries and immigration, let's look at that. Let's look at the size of the economy and access to healthcare and the labor market, and we can look at that and quantify and see, are these countries, are they good places? Are they bad places? We could look at the immigrants coming over, because we could argue that, actually we don't get that many immigrants coming from here in the first place, so why are we talking about it? Or we could look at it and say, oh, yeah, we do get a lot of immigrants from, country X and country Y, and they may seem like poor countries are not good, but if you look at what the immigrants are doing when they come over here, they're actually quite productive as members of, society. Or we can use numbers. One thing I've, seen quite a bit, and even used in classes, is you hear about the scapegoating of, we don't want immigrants coming over because of the crime that they bring over. But then when you actually look at the numbers, you see, actually, no, you're really not likely to have an immigrant, illegal or otherwise, commit a crime against you. I mean, sure, it happens, but if we're playing the odds, if we're looking at the numbers, the chances are slim that if you are going to have some kind of crime committed against you, it's going to be by some naturally born citizen who's already here, right? Because that's what the data show, right? So if I'm a positivist, when I'm faced with questions of something like immigration, I'm gonna look for numbers, right? I'm gonna look for data, and that's how I'm gonna make sense of stuff. Okay, same thing with like Black Lives Matter. If I think, if I want to prove that it's a good movement and we should support it and all that stuff, I would point to, statistics of the death of black people in this country at the hands of police or vigilantes, or however I want to quantify it. And too, if I'm against it, right, and I think Black Lives Matter is bad, and I'm a positivist, I'm going to look at rates of violence at these protests, or the rioting and looting and stuff like that. I would not just look at images on the news, but I would try to quantify and show that actually these people are a menace because look, here's the proof in the numbers themselves. Okay, so that's what positivism is all about. Okay, now this other approach, phenomenology, well, first off, it's a funny word, and you're right, we got a lot of this stuff that's just clunky, and then that can come from using Latin or Greek to make a word that sure makes perfect sense, but it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. And so phenomenology is the study of phenomena. It's the study of stuff happening. All right, that's literally what it means. And so I have this lengthy quote here. I'll read at least some of it by a philosopher who has dealt with phenomenology, an important figure in such an approach. Natural knowledge starts with experience and remains in experience. Okay? So natural knowledge, in a fuzzy way of just saying, how we know stuff, right? Things we know. Starts with experience and remains in experience. Meaning, we got to go out and experience, right? Don't give me your numbers. Don't give me tables full of crime statistics or immigration statistics or whatever. You got to get out there and do it, man, right? In the theoretical attitude that we call the natural attitude, the entire horizon of possible lines of research is accordingly designated by one world, the world. All right, so it's the idea of you get out there, and you're not going to know anything until you're actually existing in the world. Okay? Which might, I mean, it's a lengthy paragraph that basically says, like, you want to know something, get out and see it, right? That's, in some parts, it's philosophy. Just, can't say it that easy all the time. C'est la vie. But it's the idea, it's the exact opposite of positivism, in the sense that if I really want to know something, the best way to know about the world is to be in the world, right? So if I want to know whether or not the president calling certain countries shitholes, whether that's bad or good or whatever, I would say, like, you know what? I don't know, until I actually go to Uganda as well as Norway and talk to the people and meet people and experience, talk to immigrants around here, I'm not really going to know what's going on, right? Or the people who could best speak to this are not those who are sitting back in their fancy houses and away from this, but the people who are actually out there doing this stuff. Same thing with the whole Black Lives Matter idea. Don't talk to me about Black Lives Matter if you're not there at the protest, right? And again, whether or not you're there marching, for the BLM movement or against it too, right? If you're a counter protester or whatever, or even just, don't talk about it until you go there, not even as supporting, but like seeing what's going on, right? What's actually happening. Okay? That's the idea here. Okay? Now the problem, of course, like both of these are good and bad, or have their merits and all of that. But you can see, you could say, like, yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? You got to get out there and do stuff. One problem with that approach, though, is that it's a personal thing. It's a subjective thing. So, my experience going out into the world is not the same as your experience going out into the world, right? Because of a variety of things, because of my physical abilities in some cases. My ability to move through space could be easier or less easy than yours, right? Depending on my physical condition, your physical condition, stuff like that. But we also have the very socially loaded things like gender and race and all of that stuff, class, wealth, right? So there are plenty of places I can move through, no big deal. But you couldn't, and vice versa. Places where I would not feel comfortable or want to go or whatever, you would be fine. Okay, so that's one issue with phenomenology, but at least you're actually getting out into the world, right? Because you could say the issue with positivism, in many cases, is you get so hung up on numbers, and critics of that approach would be like, how can you know anything if you're just looking at numbers, if you don't have that context of what's happening out there in the world and seeing the stuff that can't be quantified. So there are good reasons to approach the world in these ways, and there are reasons not to do it, but that's what we want to be thinking about. We can have two people disagreeing about something because they're talking about the same stuff, right? We're not changing facts. We don't have somebody outright lying or just being completely ignorant or whatever. You can have two educated people discussing a concept, and they're going to be arguing like crazy. The reason for the argument, it's going to come back to this approach to knowledge. How do they know what they know? How did they gather this knowledge in the first place? And are they still using that to continue to gather knowledge and all that? And that can help to explain a lot of the conflict that we have. Why we can't all just, simply get along and discuss things and stuff like that. It's because stuff is fuzzy, right? It's messy. That's humanity, right? Messy, fussy nonsense. That's us, right? That's people. We have other approaches to this, like an idealist is someone who really what they're focused on is that ideal, okay? Whatever that ideal might be. So in this country, like going back to whether it is talking about Trump or talking about protests or the police or whatever, you have people that they hold up this ideal, whether it's the Constitution of the United States or the forefathers of the United States or just the idea of democracy or freedom or things like that, right? And it's a case of you can approach these ideals from different places. You have plenty of people who argue in favor of the Constitution for this thing, and then people will use that same Constitution to argue against the thing, and so on. But it's that idea. If we go back to, let's say, like immigration stuff, you can think of like the Statue of Liberty as kind of personifying the ideal, the symbol for that idea of us taking in immigrants. And you could argue, again, the quote on there, right, is talking about not like only bring people from non-shithole countries. No, it's saying, bring your tired, your poor, your whole masses, all that stuff. You could say, we're missing the ideal. And that's why you get upset when you hear somebody talking about immigration in this way, right? So that's how that could work. Same thing with, the police, Black Lives Matter, these protests that are, still going on. We don't see them as much in the news, but it's still happening all over the place, right? And one of the reasons why some people are protesting is precisely because of this, an ideal, right, of freedom, of some kind of, liberal sense of freedom. And I say liberal not like a Democrat, but like in the Enlightenment sense of the term, right? They're fighting for some ideal for everyone, okay? Now, materialist, this next one, is where we're, instead of getting fixated on an ideal, saying something like democracy, as if democracy just was handed down from the heavens by a god, and we discovered it in nature or something like that. A materialist approach is where you put everything into historical context. Okay, where with all this stuff, we look at the history around it and get a sense of what's really going on. Okay, so whether we're dealing with immigration again, or police brutality, or whatever it might be, we're going to look at the history and get a sense of when did, and that's the thing. Let's go to police and Black Lives Matter and defunding the police and all that stuff. The first thing a materialist would do would be question, well, why do we have police? Right? From where did this idea come? Because we tend to think, we slip into this trap just, in our daily lives, where we just kind of accept everything as being normal, natural, or whatever. We just think, haven't humans always had police officers to keep them safe because they're bad people and all that? But a materialist would say, well, no, right? And if you even question that, it's kind of like, well, of course not. We don't picture cave people, 15,000 years ago or whatever, hanging out. One starts to be a jerk, and then you hear this siren, like a Flintstones kind of thing, or whatever, and some cave cop comes over. No, that's ridiculous, right? And we know that's ridiculous, but at the same time, we don't question, from where did this concept of police come? Or in the case of immigration, the idea of countries, of nations. We'll talk about that. We tend to just kind of accept this idea of we have countries that we belong to and all that. That's actually pretty new as a concept in terms of human existence and history and all that. So a materialist would try to get at, when does this stuff show up? And in doing that, you can get a better sense. Again, I say better sense. If you're a materialist, you think it's a better sense. If you're not a materialist, you think it's a waste of time or whatever. But it's a way to, inject history to get a sense of how things really are. And we'll see examples of all this stuff as we go through. I'm just trying to kind of get this general idea out there to you. And then finally on this side, the psychoanalytic idea. That's a more kind of personal, inward-looking thing where we're talking about, how does this, whatever it is we're talking about, make individuals feel, right? What's happening, either consciously or unconsciously, to the people being affected, right? So instead of looking at big forces at work and what's happening on a global scale, if you're going at it from this psychoanalytic approach, you might be looking at more like what's happening to the individual people involved, right? Whether it's, whether you're thinking about your own psyche in this sense or others directly involved or whatever, doesn't matter, but just getting into, just like the idea of the President of the United States using bad language, that's something that we as a country, we like individuals, a lot of individuals have a hard time dealing with, even though we know, like, there's proof that pretty much, I mean, I can't say every single president has said a bad word while in office in recent years. We got plenty of evidence, whether it's tapes released later or, microphones that are left on and we pick stuff up or whatever. Plenty of evidence that, all these guys have had filthy mouths and all of that. But it's like for the first time where it seems like it's so in our face all the time, right? That veil of decorum isn't there anymore. And so people are just that fact that Trump said the SH word freaks some people out, right? And we could get at that from that psychoanalytic thing of looking like, why are people freaked out in this way? And that might influence why we don't like, what he allegedly said about these countries, or maybe why we do like it or whatever. Okay? Again, it's just we have different things we kind of tend to gravitate toward when we're trying to understand anything about the world around us. Okay? Now, what I want to do is, we got that. There's the epistemology idea, and that kind of ties in with just this whole idea of culture in general, right? How we think about culture. But I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But then I want to get into some individual thinkers, people who thought about culture either directly or indirectly, and at least discuss things that we will be discussing, right? And we'll see there's a lot of different stuff that's out there, okay? And different ways to think about culture, different ways to think about a whole variety of things. And again, what you should be doing is kind of think about, like, what do you gravitate toward? What approach do you think you fit into? Are you more all about the numbers? Are you more about experience? Interested in that historical context? Or are you more of like an ideals person? Or, whatever, right? So just keep this all churning around in your head. And it might seem like a lot of stuff and like, who cares or whatever, but this is all going to come back and we're going to be talking about specific phenomena and addressing it, how would a materialist think about it, or talk about the ideal or whatever, okay? And just to let you guys know, I tend to, gravitate toward the materialist approach. So typically, that's just what you're going to hear from me, right? So there's not a lot of idealism being promoted, because I distrust it, to be perfectly honest. But I'll try to be aware of that and point that out and have you guys think about your own thoughts about this and so on. All right. Okay, enough hedging on all this. So let's get into culture. All right, what is culture? Well, according to Raymond Williams, in his book Keywords, it's kind of dictionary of very important cultural terms that he worked on. He writes in there, culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. And of course, you know what the other 2 or other 1 is, right? Yeah, I don't know either. He doesn't actually write. As far as I can tell, he doesn't say, and the other complicated ones are brr. He just drops stuff like this throughout the books. But it's still a statement that I can't disagree with. Culture is an incredibly complicated word. I think the other, one I would pick would be nature. I don't know if Williams, thought that was what he was thinking of when he wrote this, but nature is another one of those things. It's incredibly complicated, kind of for similar reasons, in that simply it's meant so many different things to so many different people, and we don't have a really good, precise definition of it. And that can get us into trouble. That can make us, not be talking about the same thing. And so that's why I'm going to spend a little time on, what culture is and how people have approached that. Okay, so the word itself comes from the Latin cultura, referring to like cultivation, right? To grow crops, plants, for food, right? So it's the idea that, you're cultivating a plant, you're giving it the right nutrients and water and sunlight and all that stuff, and it'll grow into a healthy plant. And that is how we see, like, especially in the Victorian era, like we've got Jane Austen right here on the screen. I don't know if you guys are Jane Austen people at all. I'm not. My wife is. She likes it. I don't get it, but she does. It's great. To the point where we should be like watching one of the movies made on one of the books, and I'll just walk into the room and I'll start yelling about, the working class and the poor people. We're not saying, oh, these poor rich people, boo-hoo. I'm no fun, is the idea. But with Jane Austen, it's kind of that, like all these women that I see, and I'm saying this having just seen little bits and pieces of like made-for-TV movies. I think I had to read I read like half of Pride and Prejudice in high school. I think it was not for me. But it's the idea that like culture was a thing that you took in, right? It was that plant food. So you would learn to play the harpsichord and sing a song and cross stitch and speak French, and we have these things that we try to put into our brains so that we will be better people. We will grow into a better person, right? That's this Victorian usage of culture. And that, well, it's not, the earliest way in which this word has been used. I would argue it's the most prevalent thing today that we still kind of cling to, right? If we don't really question what culture means and all of that, we have this lingering idea of culture just being something you need, and it's the right kind of, that good culture, right? You want to go watch a French film in black and white rather than one of the, I don't know, Marvel movies or whatever, because it's the French film. It's not fun at all, and it's hard work, but that's going to help you grow, right? Where if you watch Iron Man shooting lasers out of his hands or whatever, well, that's not working for that. So that's not good culture, right? And we'll come back to that idea. We'll get into the idea of high versus low culture, good versus bad culture. But that's I think where we kind of are starting from. When we start to talk about culture, at least in the U.S. and kind of Western Europe, that vibe is still there. But there have been plenty of people to fight against it. Johann von Herder was one such person. He's a German philosopher, back in the 18th century. So we're going. This is back. And he seems like a progressive guy, right? Because he said, to quote Herder here, nothing is more indeterminate than this word, and he's referring to culture, and nothing more deceptive than its application to all nations and periods. And what he's getting at is how this term culture is garbage because it's not precise enough, basically. But what he's also complaining about is there's this attitude of, especially of the British, where there's one culture, and it's the British culture, and everyone else is measured against that ideal British culture. Okay, so Herder, and you might think a German talking about other cultures, they don't have a great track record, right? What's going on there? But really, to be fair too, what Herder is really writing about, he's not necessarily talking about brown people around the world or these types of cultures. He's really kind of pissed that the Brits are looking down at the Germans, right? So it's kind of selfish in how he's writing about this stuff, but he's still pushing for this idea of cultures, okay? A plural idea that we have multiple types of culture, and in saying that there's not one superior one that we're all trying to emulate, right? If we're not born into the one good culture, we're not all trying to work toward that. There are different ones that exist. Okay? And he's also against this idea of a linear plot toward, starting out with the inferior culture, but given enough time and enough work, everybody effectively is going to be, British. That's kind of the idea in there, that every other culture is working to be like that one good one, or eventually, once they finally mature will be just like this culture that we all know is great, right? Herder's saying that's garbage, that's nonsense, right? And that's going back to the 1700s, right? So we're talking about a long time ago. People have been pushing against this idea of good culture or one superior culture or stuff like that. Now, more recently and more locally, we have Franz Boas, who was an anthropologist early 20th century. It was like early 1900s is when he's working. He's seen as one of the founding fathers of modern anthropology, and you can see the guy. This is him in the picture. He's performing like some dance, some Native American dance, something along those lines for his students. I mean, you just look at the guy. He looks pretty cool, right? He looks like the kind of guy who would be down with other cultures and all that stuff, and that was his thing. And so he was really pushing for again, this acceptance of multiple cultures and not trying to judge other cultures against, again, a superior culture, right? So he comes up with a few ideas that we still use today. Now, number one, there's cultural relativism. Okay? And so it's the idea that cultures, they exist because of very distinct and different things, whether it's, historical events, social interactions and processes, geographic conditions, stuff like that. It's the idea that, cultures are different. And of course they're different because different stuff has happened, right? And that's why he's saying no culture is superior to another, because the only reason, let's say, the Brits or American culture, which even that is kind of a fuzzy concept, right? Like, what does it mean to be an American? We have these ideas, but because we're a land of immigrants, it gets messy. And that's why it's kind of easier to just talk about like the British, because they did have, and still plenty of them have, the idea of that cultural superiority, and they made sure to impose it around the world, right? But a guy like Boas is saying, no, don't do it. That's not cool. We shouldn't be judging any other culture. Every culture is equal and has a right to exist. What do you think? Does that seem fair? Does that seem cool? Are you cool with that, students? Yeah? I don't know. I hate this online nonsense. This whole lecture that I'd be giving, I would be, talking to you guys, trying to work you up, get you fired up and shouting at one another and all this stuff, and I'm just talking to myself in my office. Oh well. But think about it. Do you agree with this? Is this cool? You have an issue with it? Typically, I would have students in a classroom who would be like, yeah, that's cool, because nobody wants to say like, no, I want to judge other cultures. Other cultures are garbage, right? Like, it sounds good to say like, yes, everyone is created equal and everyone has a right to exist and all that. And that's fine. That's good. Here's the problem, though. With this idea of cultural relativism, one way you can push back against it is, well, what do you mean I can't judge another culture? Right? There are some cultural practices around the world that I don't like. I think they're bad. All right, that's in the United States. One of the big examples in recent years has been to point to the Muslim world, to different countries around the world, and we kind of say like, the Muslim culture. That's not a good term. There are a lot of Muslims out there. There are a lot of, Muslims in different parts of the world. We tend to, in this country, just kind of lump Muslim and like some kind of generic Middle Eastern land, some desert out there. And we think that's Muslim, right? It's way more complicated than that. But there have been plenty in the last 20 years, plenty of examples of you see women being mistreated by men in wherever. Take your pick. It's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's Saudi Arabia, wherever it might be, right? So you're telling me that if, you see a man, he beats his wife to death in another country, but he doesn't get into trouble because his culture says it's okay for a man to beat a woman if she dishonors him or whatever. You're telling me I can't judge that? Oh, yeah, this is where it starts to get fuzzy, right? Again, that's my term for the day, fuzzy, because that's what everything is. We like to have all these rigid ideas, good and bad and black and white, and no, it's all messy, complicated stuff. So yeah, then I bring this up, and students will go, oh well, yeah, that's good. We shouldn't beat women at all, which is there's a bold stance for you to take, students. So cool. So should we judge other cultures? I don't know, because here's the other issue, right? So in this country, after 9/11, we did a whole lot of judging. That led to a few wars that we're still fighting. That wasn't too good, looking back on it. But yes, we had people making all of these judgments, but then there's a question of, do we have all the information? Should we be making the judgments? One of the best experiences I had in grad school was signing up for a seminar on, I forget what it was called, but it was something like the Muslim world or whatever. I was one of two white folk in the class, and me, the other white person, and there was somebody else who we were the only three American-born students in there. So it was primarily students who were exchange students from Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all over the Middle East. They were in the class. I think they were taking it because it was like easy A, right? Because I know the Muslim world, I'm from that. So yeah, that was the demographic breakdown, and I go in thinking I know stuff and all of that, and I realized how little I knew. And one thing was like the idea of women's rights in a place like Saudi Arabia. Like, to me, it seemed like a no-brainer, right? Like, why can't women have rights? Like, what's the deal? But I remember young women in this class saying stuff like, why are you Americans so hung up with us driving? Like, it's not a big deal at all. And you guys are cool. You have just as many issues with gender equality and inequality and all that stuff in this country, but you think that because we're not allowed to drive, that makes us backward. No, and we started pointing out to looking at from a positivist standpoint, looking at the data, right? And it turned out when you started comparing certain things, Saudi Arabia and the United States not too far off when it came to women's rights and all that. So we tend to think that that other culture, yeah, they're clearly barbaric and they don't get it. No, what's wrong with them? How could anyone live like this? But then we realize, they're not much different from us, right? Now, there are clear differences. I mean, women can drive in this country, and it's just now women are able to do that over there. But it was also stuff looking at education rates and representation in government and things like that, where Saudi Arabia was actually pretty advanced compared to here in the U.S., right? So that's the thing to think about, is that I would say, yes, it's okay to judge other cultures. It's okay to judge anything, right? Because if we get into this whole we shouldn't judge, then it goes nowhere, right? It's okay to have an opinion, but what you also want to strive to do is make sure it's an informed opinion, right? And not let your own cultural biases and practices and all of that influence how you're judging another culture. Do you follow? Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know. It's, again, the idea, you know what? Just think of it this way. Cultural relativism, fuzzy. Now, another thing that Boas gave us was this idea of historical particularism, which is the idea that each culture has a unique history, which, again, comes from the relativism idea. It's unique. History as well as the geography and the other stuff at work. But because of that, we shouldn't assume that universal laws can be applied to different cultures. All right? So it's and it goes back to what Herder was talking about. This idea that if we just, wait long enough, or we just do this or that or whatever, this culture that seems kind of primitive or inferior or whatever. Now, if we do this stuff, it'll become American or British or, whatever, right? It'll have that same outcome. It's ridiculous. Everything is different. And what we'll see, and this is something we'll hold on to, like the cultural relativism thing, you can argue for it or against it, and it's got that complicated vibe to it. But with this is a very good, useful thing to keep in mind, right? This idea of historical particularism. Okay, so, and we'll see this with things like when we get into development later on, the idea of having poor countries and wealthy countries, and how do we get the poor countries to become wealthy and all that? A lot of people for many decades have just figured, hey, this stuff that worked for the US, that worked for Western Europe, that worked for these wealthy countries around the world, let's just do that, right? Let's just do this, and then everything is cool. And of course, it's not. I don't know if you've looked around lately, but we still have plenty of poor countries in the world. In fact, we have more what we would consider to be poor countries than wealthy countries. So clearly just, having this policy in place and doing this and trying to copy what worked for the wealthy countries, it's not working for the poor countries, right? Because we haven't kept this historical particularism in mind. All right, so that's what we're looking at the modern day issues, which we'll get to later on in the semester. We want to keep this in mind, that every culture is unique, both, present day and because of historical events and stuff like that. And that's why it's hard work to try to, raise the standard of living for other people. So this is good to hold on to from good old Franz Boas. And now Carl Sauer, I'm not going to talk much about him right now, but he's another important figure, with this idea of culture. And he's a cultural geographer. He was at UC Berkeley, what's known as the Berkeley School of Geography. So early 20th century, important dude here. And he made modern geography. So the kind of stuff that I like, he started a lot of that. Whereas other geographers before him, I'll introduce you to some of these folks in the weeks to come. But a lot of these, they were evil, racist as hell, and all of that had that superiority toward other cultures. Whereas Carl Sauer, he was the kind of guy who was like, no, he was following people like Franz Boas and continue that. But because he was a geographer, he's really looking at location and place, space, this kind of stuff. And he's arguing that culture, it's in these places, right? Like culture isn't something like we go see some other culture, they do a dance or whatever. We're like, oh, look at that culture, right? No, culture's all around us. And it's in our buildings and our roads, just what we call the landscape, all right? And he was the first to really push for this idea of reading the landscape, meaning when I say landscape, I'm talking about just, whatever's out there in front of us. So whatever you're looking at right now, I mean, the landscape might be your bedroom. It might be out through the windshield, the road in front of you if you're, listening to this in the car. You can walk out in your backyard and see the landscape there. You can walk through a park. There's a landscape. A downtown city area, that's the landscape, right? It's like just whatever we see in front of us. And what Sauer pushes for, and others would do this who followed, it's the idea that, let's look at this landscape and let's try to read it. Let's try to get a sense of what is this saying, right? The idea of the buildings that we build, they're giving us clues. Like if we can just figure out how to read it, we're going to get a lot out of this stuff. And I'm going to talk about that more in the next lecture. But that's a really important thing, right? We're not just talking about people interacting. We're looking at the stuff around us, and that can tell us so much. And I'll give you examples and show you guys how to do it, how to read the landscape. Oh God, I don't even know how this slide got in here. I am sorry. You might as well have a slide of the devil, right? Karl Marx, my God. All right, here's the deal. Americans. Karl Marx, not a bad guy, compared to plenty of other folks that we bring up in these college classes and all of that stuff. Marx is one of these guys who is a brilliant, brilliant thinker, but he was fussy and cranky, and he basically he didn't make many friends in that he would call a lot of people stupid, and he would point out how those in power sucked and were holding down those who weren't in power and all that stuff. And wouldn't you know it, when you tell people in power that they suck, they don't like you and they do what they can to get rid of you, right? I mean, that's in a nutshell kind of how we treat Karl Marx in this country, that he's seen as the boogeyman, but there's absolutely no reason for him to be the boogeyman at all. But he was the old communist guy, and that freaks us out. And a lot of that comes from the Cold War, and I don't know, maybe you youngsters out there, it's not the same thing. I mean, I was, started school in the 80s and into the 90s, just at the end of the Cold War. He was a bad guy. He came up in like a history class here or there or whatever, but he was always like, ooh, bad. I don't know if you get the same thing. But here's the deal. Brilliant, brilliant guy, and so useful for understanding the world around us. Okay? Now, Marx did not talk about culture. He wasn't a culture guy. For him, everything was economics. Okay? And specifically, he's looking at capitalism and trying to make sense of how capitalism works and why it works the way it does and all of that. And of course, as he's studying this stuff, it leads him to communism, right? He's seeing capitalism as a bad thing. And if you think about when he's writing, in the mid-19th century, I mean, this is a time when throughout Europe and the United States, we've got, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, and there's manufacturing and all this stuff going on. And yeah, for some people, life is good. But for those people really working in these factories, life is awful and miserable and very different in the conditions that he's writing about than what we see today. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. But for him, everything it's all about economics, and it's struggle. He sees this stuff as being, classes fighting for control and power and just like for the working class to get what what they deserve, to not be exploited and stuff like that. Okay, that's the idea. And there's nothing inherently anti-American about this or whatever. And I'll talk more about Marx when it's relevant, because he's a useful guy to know, right? To be aware of what it is he's speaking of. But we don't do that. And instead we accuse like the protesters, in LA who are holding up the pro-BLM signs being Marxists and all that. And some of them might be. But for the most part, like, nobody even knows what that term means when they use it. All right. Now, the thing that's really useful here is this idea of the base and the superstructure. Okay, which is some. Oh, hold on. I don't know if you guys can. I got a kid yelling. Yeah, hold on one second. I'm not even going to pause it. I'm going to go see what he's doing. Just check on your notes. Hold on one second. Okay, crisis averted. He just wanted to eat cookies. I don't know. What time is it? It's like 2 in the afternoon or whatever. Yeah, he can eat them. Whatever. Daddy's working. Cookies all around. Okay. So what I was saying, this whole base superstructure model. All right. And I've got this like Wikipedia diagram right here of the thing, but it's the idea. And we're talking about the base. Marx uses what's called the means of production. Okay? It means, the stuff needed to make stuff, to produce stuff, to keep the economy running. Okay? You see down here, tools, machines, factories, land, raw materials. All right? So it's the idea that we've got this economic base. That's what's keeping society running. And we could say society, we can put culture in here as kind of a stand-in. But the idea is you've got this, everything is economics kind of to start with, right? But then if you follow that blue arrow up there, we have the superstructure. This is typically what we tend to think of as culture itself, right? So this model here says everything not directly to do with production, art, family. Culture is explicitly written there. But honestly, I mean, culture is art and family and religion and, this other stuff too. But it's the idea that everything that isn't us directly working, manufacturing stuff, things that are ideas or just kind of fun little things or what we do in our free time or whatever, that would be in the superstructure. Now, one issue is people have read this to mean, and Marx doesn't help us not come to this conclusion because he's so focused on the base and that's what he's writing about. But a lot of people would argue that it's the case where the base, that's the most important thing in the world. It's all economics and all the superstructure stuff. It's just kind of, it doesn't matter. If you want to know society, focus on the base and don't worry about the superstructure. But that's not true. And that's not really what Marx was getting at. He would do what was called, he would work dialectically. Right? Dialectics, that's another term that's thrown about quite a bit. But it's the idea that when you're studying stuff, when you're trying to learn about whatever, culture, economics, take your pick, whatever it is you're trying to learn about, you're not looking for, causal relationships. This leads to this or whatever. You're looking at different things that exist and you're seeing how they interact. And everything's more of a process. And it's give and take and all that. And that's what this model is showing here. It's the idea that, yes, the base, that is the kind of raw economics in society. Yes, of course, that influences superstructure, influences all that cultural stuff that we got. But that cultural stuff at the same time is going to influence economics and the base, right? It's not one leads to the other. It's this constant process of back and forth. Okay? And that's a very useful thing to think about as we go through here. And we'll see examples of this stuff. Most of what I have researched and written about and worked on and what I still continue to read about and study and all that, it has to do with the superstructure. That's what I'm interested in, right? But what I'm interested in is how that superstructure goes on to affect everything else. Right? And in turn is affected by the base. Okay? It's using that dialectical reasoning in there. So we'll spend some time, I'll talk about, media quite a bit because that's something I like to focus on. And the idea of what does it mean to consume media? I'm not talking about just the news media, but I mean listening to music, watching movies, reading comic books, playing video games, that kind of stuff that seems like a distraction or a diversion or just a fun thing or whatever. How does that influence the rest of society or how we feel about the rest of society or the base itself and all of that, right? Again, I'm throwing out a lot of stuff at you right here, right now, and I get it if all this is kind of... not sure what this said, you thought you were just going to be pointing at maps and memorizing river lengths and all that stuff. I get it. Sorry, that's not what we're doing. Just go with this stuff for now, and it'll come back, and we'll start building on some of these things, okay? So hopefully you're not lost and totally confused. Or, actually, if you're lost and totally confused, that's fine. That's okay, baby. That's what we're trying to do right now is to, we jump into that pool of knowledge, and immediately immerse ourselves in it. And it might be confusing and scary at first, but it's going to be okay. We're going to get through it, all right? But Marx, what we're taking from this, there's this whole dialectical model of the base and the superstructure. We'll return to this a bunch, but also I just want to let you know right off the bat, he's not the boogeyman. And we're going to use him and other thinkers and all that, people who aren't quite as scary to people and so on. But he's quite useful here. Now another guy quite useful, is Michel Foucault, who was a French philosopher from the 20th century. Now, he's not a geographer. We're going to talk about so few geographers in here, at least with this initial stuff. Because honestly, you don't have to be a geographer to have good ideas about how the world works. Some people in like these intro textbooks and stuff will get all hung up on, we're going to introduce geographers. And like with Marx, it's the kind of thing like sociologists love to claim Marx, and they all talk about him, and they get fussy if somebody else does and all that. Like, shut up. But Foucault, this guy, fantastic. So his whole deal was, again, working in this materialist vein, looking at the historical context, not directly invoking Marx or anything like that. But his whole deal was this idea of power and knowledge. Okay, and it's the idea, going back to this idea of truth, which we can, think of, the knowledge we learn in school, right? We're often taught these things, these truths, these facts, and all of that. And he's arguing that's all produced by people with power, okay? Whoever has power. And he's not talking about power as being like, 5 white men in some dark room somewhere in, the middle of nowhere, like James Bond villains or whatever, that are deciding who, lives and dies. It's not like that kind of supervillain power. Power is everywhere, according to Foucault. It's, throughout society. He discusses disciplinary power, which is, think like disciplining. We'll use discipline in the sense of like the discipline of geography. Kind of like that, but kind of not. But you can think of discipline as like punishment as well, right? Or being, forced to follow rules and all of that. And he would say yes, to all of this stuff. But things like schools, prisons themselves, like my favorite book that he wrote was Discipline and Punish, maybe the one he's best known for too, but it's all about the modern prison system and the idea of like why we have it, why it is the way it is. And he questions, is it really more humane than when we, we had a criminal and we would beat them for days in the public square until we finally ripped them apart and all of that. In fact, that's why I love Discipline and Punish. She spends like the first, 10 pages or whatever, just graphically describing this criminal just getting tortured for days, and you're reading, you're like, this is philosophy? All right. And then it gets harder to get through. It's less sexy as you continue on, but it's a good opening to this work, right? But it's the idea, he's arguing that, this idea of, just brutal torture and all of that, we tend to think we're making progress and we're being more humane to prisoners. He's saying, no, it might look like that. We're just shifting power and power relationships and things like that. Okay? And this whole idea of knowledge in the institutions like schools and prisons and the military and stuff like that, that's where power is channeling through, and it's producing this subjectivity, meaning we're becoming good citizens, becoming good Americans or whatever, through these institutions, but that's power, right? We're being turned into the people we are. And he really argues against this idea of being an individual, right? That we would say like, nonsense. I'm my own person. I'm an individual person and all that. And he would say, are you? Right? And one of his big terms was the conditions of possibility. The idea that we're not who we are because of some innate, being inside of us, but we've been shaped by all of this power running around us. We become who we are because of this society into which we were born. All right? And he's not fully against the notion of like free will or anything like that, but it can be pretty dark. It can be pretty depressing where you kind of realize, oh, I'm not the special little flower I thought I was. No, I've been molded into this way by power I can't even see. Yeah, it can be kind of dark in that way. A lot of students resist these ideas early on, just if for no other reason, because it doesn't feel nice to read about this and think about this stuff and all that. But Foucault is incredibly, I don't know, he's influential for my own work, and therefore everything I'm going to be talking about, all these ideas where I'm like, oh, look how brilliant I am, it's all because of guys like this, who I read and shaped a lot of stuff. But here, to quote Foucault, I don't know if this will help or not, we should admit that power produces knowledge, that power and knowledge directly imply one another, that there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. So like everything, in fact, everything I'm talking to you about in here, these things you're learning in college, whether it's this class or other classes or whatever, there's a lot of power there, right? And he came to this conclusion in going back to seeing the very beginnings of the sciences, the medical sciences and the natural sciences and these different things that we just kind of treat as like, science is good and all that. And I'm not anti-science at all, nor was Foucault an anti-science, but it's the conditions in which this stuff came to be, the way in which we think it's acceptable to study the world around us. There's a lot of power, in there, right? And if for no other reason, I mean, it can be kind of obvious as you're looking through these pictures of people that I'm showing up, of these brilliant thinkers. You notice a trend with these guys, a lot of white dudes, right? I mean, Foucault, he was gay at least. I mean, that's diverse, right? That's very non-heteronormative or whatever. But he has a bunch of white dudes so far. Like that, and Foucault wasn't saying, it's all white dudes. But I mean, that right there, that's kind of like an early, warning sign as we look at it today. There's some power in there, right? That's something we want to think about. And of course, it's not all white dudes to do this. Look, there's a white lady, right? Look at me being all inclusive. Doreen Massey, not a token at all. She was a brilliant woman and a brilliant geographer. That's another great thing. She's an actual geographer. We get to claim her. But her whole idea was to challenge how we think about space. And we'll be talking about space, down the road. In a few weeks, I'll discuss space and place and get into some deep discussions about that. But she was arguing for this idea of multiplicities of space. Multiplicity meaning it's the idea of no one superior concept of space or whatever. It's the idea that we all, as we, enter a situation, encounter other people, whatever it might be, we're bringing with us a lot of other stuff. And the people we encounter, that's bringing a lot of stuff. What we're doing is we're producing the space around us. Okay? And so we're not talking about outer space, that kind of, NASA kind of stuff. Space is a fuzzy term in that it's just kind of there, and people have said different things about it. But it's the idea that what I'll say about it now is that it's not just as simple as like the room that you're in right now, or wherever you are right now, listening to this. That's the place, right? You're in some location. But what's going on in that room? Like the very fact that you're listening to me ramble on about this stuff, that's helping to produce the space of the room itself. Like right now it sucks. It's like 150 degrees outside. I'm pouring sweat. I try to keep the fan off so it doesn't make some awful whirring noise as I'm recording this stuff. And it's like, I'm doing this in the fall semester. That's when I'm recording this thing, but it's technically, so we're in the fall semester, but it's 150 degrees outside. I'm hot and I'm sweaty. And that's making a space right now in here, right? The feelings I have, the way I'm responding to this stuff. I swear to God, if I could just wait, like a month and let it get down in temperature, if I could be recording this when leaves are turning orange and I could have my professor uniform on, right? My tweed jacket and all that stuff. This would be such a better lecture because I'd be in professor mode, right? It would feel like they're going back to school and all that good stuff. I'd be smoking my pipe and discussing this stuff. And I would picture you guys sitting around your, I don't know, dorm rooms, whatever your students have. I don't pay attention. But yeah, you'd just be doing, college-y stuff, and there'd be a chill in the air, and right? It's a very simple concept here of space, but because it's hot, I'm behaving differently, right? And how I'm approaching this is happening differently. You might be hearing this message, and you're responding differently because of the spatial things around you. And it can be physical stuff, the temperature and the weather itself and all that. It can be other people in the room. It could be the room itself, right? If you're listening to this, I don't know, in a coffee shop, right? Hopefully 6 feet away from other people and with a mask and all that stuff, but that could produce kind of, you feel like you're playing the part of the student, right? Because of course, good students go to the coffee shop to learn and all that. And okay, think about that. The idea that, we're dealing with, I'm recording this in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, that is affecting how we're learning, how we're responding to this stuff, just, how we're feeling, right? That's space, right? It's not just the physical location, it's all the other stuff that influences what's going on in that physical location. And Massey's arguing it's not just all about you, right? It's not that one superior culture. It's not that one superior perspective. There are a lot of other people encountering that same space, and as different people come in, to the same place, I guess, and then produce, their own space, we get that whole multiplicity of space concept. A lot of different perspectives out there. And what Massey was also saying is that one of the reasons that we don't really think about this fact that other people exist in the world. Like she talks about, Cortez and the Aztecs, like going, back to Europeans sailing around the world and running into other folks. We treat this like, the Aztecs were just kind of sitting around still, waiting to be discovered by Cortez, right? And when we're telling our histories of Latin America, and the pre-Columbian peoples who live there, the Aztecs and the Maya and the Inca, all the indigenous folks in the Americas themselves, we treat them like, they're just kind of sitting around, and some white folks show up, and then the story gets rolling, right? And she's arguing that, no, that's absurd. They were producing their own spaces and have their own history and all that stuff going on. But then we also tend to look at all this stuff, these stories of development and progress and all that, as it's a story of time, right? It's the idea that we're talking about history as if everything's leading up to something. Going back to that idea of historical particularism and the idea that people still struggle to not think about the world as everybody just trying to get up to that same level, right? If you don't have that same level of technology and knowledge and all that I have, you're primitive, you're backwards, you exist in in the past, right? That's the idea. And Massey is saying that's nonsense. It's total nonsense. Okay? And we've got this here. It's long. I pull a lot of this stuff, mainly because I like it. And I think it's beautiful poetry. But then I see it, I think about reading it and go, blah. But let me read a little bit of it, at least. So this is Massey. This was in an interview for explaining, some of her work and what it is she does. She, too, was talking about power, like Foucault. Power is the ability to do things. What I do find that we should be critical of in the social sciences, and social sciences means geography and anthropology and sociology, these ways of trying to methodically study humanity, okay, social sciences, what we should be critical of is the unequal distribution of power. Power of some groups over others, power of some places over others. Now there's another way, which I think relates back to the very way in which we think about space. The way in which we look at globalization at the moment. It turns space into time. For instance, we are often using a terminology of we are developed countries. The countries behind us, as it were, are developing, and then you've got underdeveloped countries. Now what that does is to convert contemporaneous difference between those countries into a single linear history. Okay? It's the idea that we're telling the single story of progress, right? And developed, it means like first world. We'll talk about these different terms later on, but developed means the rich countries, the United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, right? Developing are those ones that aren't quite there yet, but they're trying, bless their hearts, they're trying to become wealthy. And then underdeveloped, that's really what we're thinking of as the third world. These are the really poor countries. You say third world and images spring to mind, right? And we'll discuss these images. But what you're saying is it is this idea. We still tell the story of, given enough time, these poor countries, they're going to catch up to us, right? Catch up, as if they're not just a different place, right? And that's this contemporaneous difference means that, yeah, we have different places around the world, but we look at them and we explain them and we tell these stories based on our own perspectives and all that, and we eradicate anything they're doing, right? We'll talk about this with development later on and how we treat some of these poor countries. So what Massey's saying here is it's saying that that country over there, let's say it's Argentina, a developing country, isn't a country at the same moment, which is different, but it's a country which is following our historical path to become a developed country like us. So in a sense, we are denying the simultaneity, the multiplicity of space that I want to insist on, and turning all those differences into a single historical trajectory. What she's effectively saying is, yeah, these places that are different from us, exactly, they're different from us. They occupy the same time, right? But they're producing their own space. They're in a different place. They're existing in the space of the earth differently from us. Not that they're existing, in the past, backwards in time in this way, but it's different. And some of this stuff, it might not sound like this radical thing when you first hear it, but as we start to discuss this stuff, it'll become clear that anything you've heard about before, we tend to do this, like when we talk about poor countries. But what happens if we start to question some of this stuff? Again, don't get hung up on knowing exactly what she's talking about right now. Just go with it. Let it kind of wash over you, and then we'll get more practical examples as we move forward with the class. All right, let's see. Okay, I think we got like 2 more of these, and then we'll stop here, and then we'll just get into some fun culture talk in a bit. But I want to talk about at least 2 more important figures. We have Homi K. Bhabha, who's a post-colonial scholar. Post-colonial meaning looking at these former colonies of the world, like India being a former British colony, right? Meaning they're part of the British Empire. Britain was in control. They gain independence. A lot of these places gain independence. We still have some colonies out there, what we call territories or whatever. We have them, in this country, in the U.S. So some of these still exist, but there was a big push for decolonization, letting these people, have control of their own destiny, right? And so Bhabha and others have focused on this. But one thing that Homi Bhabha came up with, this concept that he popularized that I think is important, is this idea of hybridity. Okay? And it's the idea that if we speak in something like, national terms, like I can say I'm an American, but what does that mean, really? I think for most of you guys in the class listening to this, you would consider yourselves to be American, unless you're an exchange student or something like that. I don't know. I might have a few. I do from time to time. I don't know because it's all been virtual this semester when I'm recording this. But even that can be kind of a not useful term. And we could say Japanese or Indian or British or whatever, right? So you've got that. And what we tend to do is we have this binary where it's it's me and then it's everybody else, right? The self and the other. So if I say I'm American, it's quite often in contrast to some other, some different national, some non-American, right? But at the same time, I'm not just an American. Like, I can have all sorts of qualities to list about myself, right? Race, ethnicity, gender, class, like economic class, all that kind of stuff. And all of you other Americans listening to this, you could list these things, and there's a good chance that we're not going to match up with all of these, identifiers I have, and that's great. But at the same time, that kind of leads to some of the trouble that we have. And he's like in his book, and go ahead and if you really want to fully nerd out, you want to go find a book by Homi Bhabha, have at it. I want to recommend doing it. He's so difficult to get through. His writing is not the nicest to deal with, but still some good ideas, to get to. But finding a summary of his work might make you happier. But like as he's writing about this idea of hybridity, he's talking about there's a British coal miner strike in Britain in the early 80s or whatever, and he was talking about with this big strike, you had coal miners striking, and it was seen as a class-based thing, like working class. The coal miners are not wealthy folks, right? They're working class people, and so they're identifying as such. And so we see that with, like especially labor disputes and going on strike and union stuff and all of that. It's usually working class people versus the upper class folks who are in charge, right? In this case, the people who own the coal mines or whatever, right? So it was based on these class ideas, but you had, white male working class people pushing for stuff, but then you have like black female working class coal miners who, they wanted, they had these class interests, but they also had different interests because of race and gender and all of that, right? And it made it more complex. And so we can see that with something like, the protests that we're having going on, here in 2020. You have stuff like Black Lives Matter stuff, which seems to be based in race, but then other stuff isn't just about race, it's about class stuff, things like healthcare, whether you have healthcare or not. It's a big issue. People have been fighting over in recent years in this country. And then you've also got gender stuff and like Me Too movement kind of stuff and all that, sexuality, whether it's, gay, lesbian, transgender, bi, there's everything out there. And so it's the idea. And again, it's one of these ideas where you think about it for a minute and you're like, yeah, that makes sense. But we don't necessarily think about it until it's pointed out to us. It's an idea that we're all hybrid subjects, all of us, right? And we negotiate these different identities that we have, right? Sometimes I'm thinking in terms of economic class when I'm doing something. Other times I'm thinking, and this is whether it's conscious or unconscious, in terms of my gender, right? Or my age, or my, race, or whatever. It might be all of these different things. And what we need to do as we're studying all this stuff, power and space and place and culture and all this stuff. I mean, a lot of it, look, I'm not interested in just pointing out culture for culture's sake and saying, like, isn't this quaint? You want that, take an anthropology class. No, what I'm doing is I want to point out, like, how life sucks and try to move forward so we understand our culture and what's wrong with it, where we've got some issues, and we got them. You can't deny that. You've seen a homeless person, I'm guessing. I mean, that's whether, no matter how you feel about the homeless, it's, like whether it's, these people are victims or, they just didn't work hard enough or whatever, it's still an issue. No one should go like, yay, homeless, right? It's not good. I think we can all agree on that. Maybe not. There'll be one of you who's like, no, I'm cool with it. But you're just being a jerk. No, but it's the idea that like, that's something we should work toward eradicating, right? People who don't have places to live, right? Or not, in of doors, all of that. But in order to do that, we got to be thinking about all this stuff, right? The hybridity, the multiplicities of space, power, these power relationships, that kind of stuff. All right, so that's why I bring up Baba, and we'll see more of this as we get going. Okay, last one, I swear. Stuart Hall. This guy was the man. So good. So he was a British sociologist, founder of the field of cultural studies, or at least one important founder. And one of the things, I think one reason why he was so good and had so many great ideas is he was, British living in England, but of Jamaican ancestry. There's a colony, former colony of the Brits. And so he's negotiating that hybridity, before Bob is even talking about that stuff. He's, what does it mean to be black, to be British, to be all of these things? And I think, that kind of made him more insightful about a lot of stuff. But what he did, which I love and take from and will be introducing to you in future weeks, is just this whole idea of ideology and media and how these things go hand in hand. Whether it's news media, it's like the news itself, right? Or it's other stuff. And I'll be talking more about the other stuff. Music, film, art, those kinds of things. But how does that help to naturalize ideas that we have? Okay, so this first question here, does media influence us? We'll come back to that more when I get to just media geographies in general. But it's the idea, like we can laugh at that. Like it really it didn't even start there. Like I remember the Columbine shootings. It was the idea that Marilyn Manson caused these kids to shoot up a school. And so a lot of politicians especially freaked out that, oh, we got to ban Marilyn Manson. Like that's going to get rid of violence, right? And we had that before, even earlier in the 90s and 80s, the idea of like listening to music is going to make you kill yourself or kill somebody else or whatever. We have a lot of that. Violent video games. That's one that keeps showing up from time to time, where it's the idea of like, video games, oh, these kids are playing these violent video games and that's why they're all awful little criminals and, murdering people and all of that. And for the most part, most people, at least from what I've seen, is that most people say that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. All right? Like you can play a video game that has guns in it, Fortnite or I don't know, whatever kid thing you kids are into these days with your Xboxes and all that. And so you play in the game and you can shoot at people in the video game and you don't instantly say like, I should do this in reality, right? Like it's not like it's a mind control thing. But what I would say is there's a lot of control, and I don't even want to say control, because control, again, makes it sound like it's mind control, supervillain kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on, right? Where the media we consume, whether it is news media, whether it's you're watching CNN or Fox, like, Fox News or MSNBC, you can say like, oh yeah, that's clearly ideological and it's conveying this point of view and all of that. But you say which is why I watch CNN, right? Or why I read the New York Times or whatever it might be that you think is not, controlling in this way. Stuart Hall argued quite well that in all of it is, it's all a tool of power, right? It's all reinforcing the status quo, and it's going to keep those in power. And so if you're listening to this and you're in power, you're saying like, well, great, yeah, cool, let's keep doing that. But chances are, AVC students, if you're listening to this, you're not in power at all. Very few people in power go to the desert community college, right? And I'm not saying that to mock you if you're, in this class. Hell, I'm teaching the class, right? What does that say about me? I'm not at Harvard or whatever. But so that's the thing, is that if you're not in power, well, it might be good to study this stuff to get a sense of, well, why am I not in power? Why is that? Why do I accept that fact that I have such little power? And Wall was pointing to media and ideology in general, and kind of going back to this whole base superstructure idea, but focusing on the superstructure, see why it is we're okay with where we are in the base, right? And why we're okay where we are in terms of class and all that, and what can we do to resist power. All right, so that's the idea there. That's all of the stuff. This was a real quick introduction here to each of these different thinkers, but these are all ideas that are going to come back and they're going to help us make sense of the world. All right, I know this, and this one was kind of dense and all that. Next time, look at that. We got ballet dancers and we got that demon man. Oh, it's going to be so much. We're going to go back to, I don't know if I have more potty pictures, but it's going to be back to that kind of stuff, right? So like this was our vegetables that we just had, and now we're going to get, I think we're going to talk like marijuana a lot. I think that comes up in slides. So we'll talk your drugs that you kids are into. Plenty, again, to talk about culture. But until then, have a lovely rest of your day or evening or whatever. Make sure to keep reading, keep, paying attention to the stuff, taking notes and all of that. And as always, you got any questions, any other stuff didn't make sense, you just want to chat in general about whatever, shoot me an email. We'll chat. All right? All right. Talk to you later, geographers.